This is the Political Dispatch.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. I will not.
Why are you so keen that I should involve myself in the internal affairs of Cuba and Libya? I expect you to be consistent. I don't know if I have paralyzed you.
No. Aren't Arabs terrified? Aren't Iraqis terrified? Don't Arab and Iraqi women weep when their children die? Doesn't bombing strengthen their determination?
I just got health insurance for the first time a month ago. This is not an elitist issue. This is a quality of life issue.
You cannot continue to victimize somebody else just because you yourself were a victimized. There has to be a limit.
The golden age of America begins right now.
Welcome back to the Political Dispatch, the podcast where we explore the world's headlines and trace their roots through the past to make sense of the present. I am Tom Spare.
I'm Lily Mott.
And I'm Sid Kurapati.
Today we're looking at the war with Iran and its relation to the cost of living.
In recent years, we've seen plenty of economic and political shocks. The 2007-2008 financial crash, Brexit, the first presidency of Donald Trump, the pandemic we're still living through, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Trump's tariffs, the invasion of Venezuela, and now the war with Iran, launched by Israel and the US. The list goes on, and that's just to name a few.
So by attacking Iran, Israel and the United States have opened the world to a huge number of uncertainties. We're going to go first through how we got here.
And then we're going to look at the impact the Iranian conflict is having and might potentially have on the world economy and your everyday life.
We are doing this episode to demonstrate that what happens halfway across the world can have a huge impact on everyday life wherever you're listening to this right now. So let's dive in. To understand where we are now, you need to go back to late December 2025. Iran was already in crisis. Massive anti-government protests had been building for months, and the Iranian regime responded with extraordinary brutality. Estimates vary widely depending on the source. The Iranian government put the death toll at around 3,000. U.S. officials were citing figures closer to 30,000, and some human rights organizations have suggested it could be higher still.
Tens of thousands more were detained. Trump, watching all of this unfold, saw an opportunity. So on the 13th of January 2026, he told the Iranian people to, quote, to take over your institutions and that, quote, help is on its way. That phrase matters because what followed was a promise that at least so far hasn't been kept. Through January and February 2026, the US and Iran were still actually talking. Indirect negotiations were happening in Oman, mediated by the Omani foreign minister. But the two things were happening simultaneously. On one hand, the US was amassing military assets in the region at a scale not seen since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And on the other hand, Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu was in Trump's ear, pushing hard for military action. On the 10th of February, Netanyahu met Trump personally and made the case that Iran was ripe for regime change, painting the picture, according to the New York Times, of a short war that would spark a new wave of protests and bring the regime down. U.S. intelligence reportedly described the plan as farcical. However, Trump went ahead anyway.
So on the 28th of February 2026, the US and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran. One thing we should note that in the previous summer, Israel and the US had targeted Iranian uranium enrichment related to their potential nuclear program. And at the time, Trump had said that they had sort of got rid of the nuclear threat, but they can continue to talk about the nuclear threat. So either Trump was lying then, or he's lying now, or potentially both. Who knows? The timing is worth noting. It was during Ramadan, and it happened while negotiations were still nominally ongoing. The strikes were the product of months of deliberate deception, including manipulating satellite imagery so Iran couldn't see them coming. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was assassinated multiple officials were killed. And in one of the most devastating moments of the opening day, a strike hit a girls' elementary school in southern Iran, killing at least 175 people, which most of them were children. I believe it was, I think it's one of the worst civilian killings in recent years by the US military. And the US later described it as a targeting mistake. It actually used a combination of AI in part of the planning of the bombing. And there's a suggestion that the data that the AI used to identify the target was out of date. That was the claim that was made at the time. The regime was supposed to collapse. It didn't. Within hours, Iran launched hundreds of missiles and drones at Israel, at US military bases across the Gulf, and critically, it closed the Strait of Hormuz.
The human cost started mounting almost immediately. On the 1st of March, 6 U.S. soldiers were killed in a drone attack in Kuwait, the first American deaths of the war. By mid-March, the number had risen to at least 13, including 6 more killed when a military refueling aircraft crashed in Iraq. Rather than the regime crumbling, it adapted. On the 8th of March, Mojtaba Khamenei, the Supreme Leader's son, was named as his father's successor. Trump called him an unacceptable choice. The new Supreme Leader responded on the 12th of March with his first statement, directing the military to continue choking off the Strait of Hormuz. The message was clear: Iran wasn't going anywhere.
Trump, meanwhile, had been telling the world that the war was nearly over, almost from the moment that it had started. It's worth just listening to the pattern here. So on the March 17th, he said, "We won this. This war has been won." On 24th March, he said, "It won't be much longer. We're way ahead of schedule." On 26th March, he says, "It won't be long. Going to end soon. We had to take a little detour." And on the 6th of April, just 2 days before the ceasefire, he said, "We won. Okay, they are militarily defeated." Each statement turned out to be premature. What this tells you is not just that Trump was wrong, it's that the administration fundamentally misjudged how this war would go.
I just feel like Trump is a person on a project that just says, "I'm going to get this done, guys. Don't worry about it," and then just comes up with different ways of saying. And it just demonstrates how much of this was his gut reaction to go, "I'm going to do this." They're not being a plan. So through March, the strikes continued. On the 17th, 2 more of Iran's top leaders were killed. On the 18th, Israel attacked Iran's South Pars gas field, striking, which was responsible for around 70 to 75% of Iran's natural gas production. Iran hit back by striking Qatar's Ras Laffan facility, the largest liquefied natural gas export plant in the world. By this point, oil prices had risen by 40% from where they were before the war. Analysts were describing it as the biggest energy crisis in history, with around 13 million barrels of oil a day effectively removed from the global supply chain because of the strait closure and because of the attacks on the different oil fields. And this is before we even get into fertilizers, plastics, aluminium, and all the other things that flow throughout that waterway.
After weeks of back and forth, with Pakistan stepping in as a mediator, a 2-week ceasefire was agreed on the 8th of April, just 90 minutes before Trump's deadline to launch further strikes. But even that announcement was immediately complicated. Israel launched massive strikes on Lebanon the same day, with Israel and the U.S. insisting Lebanon wasn't covered by the deal, while Pakistan and Iran said it was.
Just a quick one. Trump said he was going to wipe the Iranian, destroy the civilization of Iran.
Yeah. Quote, he said, "Tonight a civilization would die." Yes. And there's one more thread worth pulling on before we move to the economic impact, and that's the moral dimension of all of this. Pope Leo, traveling in Africa, spoke out against the war, calling for peace and unity. The response from the Trump administration was striking. J.D. Vance, a practicing Catholic, told the Pope to be, quote, "careful when he talks about matters of theology," end quote. Think about that for a second. A sitting vice president of the United States himself a Catholic, telling the leader of the Catholic Church to stay in his lane on theology. It tells you something about the confidence, or perhaps the arrogance, with which this administration has pursued this war. And it's now worth noting that only 39% of the Americans now say that the United States is a moral authority in the world, down from 60% in 2017. The Pope speaking out at this particular moment landed at a very vulnerable time for Trump politically.
And that's just crazy because that's 39% of Americans saying that we're no longer the moral authority, which is just,
Marking your own homework, isn't it,
exactly.
really?
We're very patriotic people. How the turntables.
Exactly.
I wonder if that would be like the similar opinions of, say, like the British at the height of the British Empire, say, like, we're a moral force in dealing with all of this. I don't know if it's like peak powers where, like, we can talk about this later with China, but yeah, I feel like it's, all of this is questioning America's role in the world, basically. So where does that leave us right now? The ceasefire is incredibly fragile. The Islamabad talks failed, involving JD Vance. So he went to he tried to get involved in these talks. They were a failure. He went to Hungary, and the prime minister of 16 years got kicked out. Yeah, he's not got a particularly good success rate on the international stage, but there we go. Trump announced a naval blockade of the Strait in response to Iran's blockade. So we've got like double blockade. And the regime is still intact. The Iranian people were told that help was coming, and it came in the forms of bombs, including on a school. I mean, thousands of people, thousands of people have been injured, many killed. We don't really have a full record of the amount of people in Iran that have been killed. And, the Strait, which carries a significant chunk of the world's trade, I think it's about a fifth of the world's trade, remains disrupted. And the economic consequences of all this are now being felt far beyond the Middle East, which is what we really want to dig into. It's now adding this tension because the US is sailing warships through the Strait to protect sort of cargo ships and everything. And China has a massive military naval base in Djibouti. And the question mark comes, if China sends ships through the Strait of Hormuz and the Americans intercept, what happens then? That's a sort of tinderbox situation.
So we've provided the background and the context. Let's look at some other examples which demonstrate global impacts of this war.
Yeah, and I think it's worth highlighting the fact that the Iranian people are at the center of this war. And as we've mentioned, Trump said help's on the way, and this hasn't exactly helped their situation. It's actually made it a lot more complex, as well as the surrounding neighbors around Iran, which, lots of people have been impacted by this. But what we want to say is these faraway places has huge impact on our everyday life. And we can use Ireland as a really good example of this. Since the 8th of April, Ireland has seen what commentators have described as arguably some of the most serious civil unrest since the Irish state was founded in the 1920s. So farm contractors and hauliers, the people who rely on diesel and petrol to do their jobs, staged go-slow convoys on motorways, blockaded ports and shut down fuel depots across the country. At one point, Ireland was on the verge of turning away oil tankers entirely. Around 40% of petrol stations across the country were empty at the weekend. The Irish army was deployed to remove protesters. Arrests were made. Pepper spray was used in Dublin's O'Connell Street. And a junior minister has resigned.
And why? Because since the US and Israel launched strikes on Iran on the 28th of February, diesel prices in Ireland have risen around 28% and petrol around 25%. This is an enormous increase in a very short amount of time. Hauliers and farmers are the people who feel it first and most acutely. Their entire livelihoods depend on fuel, but it doesn't stop there. Ireland has only one oil refinery. It imports almost everything. And 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas shipments normally pass through the Strait of Hormuz, which is now effectively closed. Ireland is one of the most import-dependent economies in Europe, which makes it particularly exposed.
The Irish government has had to move fast. It announced concessions worth almost $600 million, a 10% reduction on diesel and petrol, a postponement of a planned carbon tax. It survived a vote of no confidence brought by Sinn Féin, but only just. The Taoiseach compared the blockades to being unconscionable and illogical. And the writer Fintan O'Toole, writing in the Irish Times this week, warned that the crisis could further provide fertile ground for a far-right movement in Ireland to grow, drawing parallels with the Yellow Vests in France and agrarian protest movements that have been captured by populist right parties in Germany and Spain. So this isn't just about fuel prices. It's about how economic shocks become political shocks and how quickly they progress.
This crisis is constructed too. These are very clear choices that have been made without much planning. And we're sort of seeing play out what has been on the cards for a very long time. And this is why so many presidents have not done what Donald Trump's done, because you're unlocking lots of demons here in various different ways. So there's also Northern Ireland angle worth noting briefly. Protests were planned across 8 road routes in the north this week, but they largely failed to materialise, partly because Northern Ireland's devolved government has no power over tax policy and partly because trade unions and farming groups kept their distance. So the most interesting voice was Sinn Féin's Michelle O'Neill, who pointed to the British involvement in the US-backed military campaigns in the Middle East as a contributing to the crisis and vowed to protect people here because of policy decisions taken in London. That is a quietly significant statement. It connects a fuel protest in Belfast directly to decisions being made in Washington and Tel Aviv, and it adds to the tensions that exist between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland and the British state. And the borders and boundaries are always big areas of contention.
Ireland is one country, and you can also draw a straight line from this to the UK, where the NFU, the National Farmers Union, has already raised concerns about the impact of rising fuel and fertilizer costs on British agriculture. And you can draw it to every other country in Europe that imports food, fuel, and goods that either come from the Middle East or that require energy to produce. Ireland just happened to get there first. It's the canary in the coal mine, which is very much a Tom statement. That is not my line, everyone listening. That is a poetic Tom line. So
We're interrupting our normal political dispatch programming for an important message.
On the 7th of May, 2026, elections will take place for the Senate in Wales, the Scottish Parliament, the London Assembly, and for various councils across England.
So if you're eligible to vote in the UK, you need to make sure you're registered. You're not automatically registered to vote. I repeat, you're not automatically registered to vote.
So in order to register to vote, you have to head to www.gov.uk/register-to-vote to check and sign up. The deadline is 11:59 p.m. on the 20th of April, 2026.
If you live in England or Northern Ireland, you need to be 16 or over to register. In Scotland and Wales, the age is 14. British and Irish citizens can register, as can many Commonwealth citizens and some EU citizens. Check the website for full details.
So once you're registered, you can vote in person, by post, or by proxy. If you're not registered after this date and time, you will not be able to vote on the 7th of May.
So please check in with your family, friends, and colleagues to make sure they're registered as well. Every vote matters. Thanks, guys.
And that brings us to the thing that is going to hit almost everyone in the coming months, whether they follow geopolitics or not. The price of food. Because what's happening to fertilizer right now, because of this war, is something that will work its way through to the supermarket shelves, whether the ceasefire holds or not. Let's explain why that's the case. The Strait of Hormuz doesn't just carry oil. Around 20 to 30% of global fertilizer exports transit that waterway, including roughly 23% of ammonia and 34% of urea, the most widely used nitrogen-based fertilizers in the world. When the strait closed or blocked, that supply didn't just slow down, it stopped, and the fertilizer prices have responded accordingly. Global urea futures have risen 49% since before the war. And in the United States, state of Illinois, average urea prices are up by 42%. And in the UK, farmers are facing similar pressures. And this is happening right now as we record this episode, during the spring planting season, which is the single most important period of the year for fertilizer application.
And one thing, as I was doing some research for this, which is quite interesting, when there are energy crises, farmers move from food production to energy production. So they often use the contents of their farms to move from producing particular types of soy, for example, and other things, and use that for biomass instead. Because they're obviously going to make a lot of profit out of that, because ultimately farms are businesses. That's something to bear in mind. The UN World Food Programme has estimated that if oil prices stay above $100 a barrel beyond June, which is entirely plausible given where we are, the number of people facing acute hunger globally could increase by 45 million people. 45 million. We're not just talking about a distant future scenario. The United States Department of Agriculture is already estimating that around 25% of American farmers have not yet purchased the fertilizer they need for the 2026 spring planting season because the cost is now simply too high. Farmers who can't afford fertilizer don't use it. Crops that don't get enough fertilizer produce less. I mean, there's lots of arguments about fertilizer on food, and in the US, there's often overuse of pesticides, which then impacts the quality of food. But also, if, for example, there is issues in the autumn, which there could be because El Nino is on the way in that's hot weather.
So the El Nino starts from the Pacific and moves eastward. So it goes towards the Americas and kind of covers the southern belt and South American, sort of Central American region, bringing in hot oceanic climate.
And then would impact lots of different farming as well. So we could have an unseasonably high temperature of autumn, which then affects the harvest as well. So not only are you going to have unprotected crops, you're going to have very high temperatures later in the year. And what's that due to, kids? Global climate change. So it's not a myth, it's a real thing. So farmers can't afford fertilizers, they don't use it. Crops don't get enough fertilizer, they produce less. Food is on the global market, means higher prices. It's a chain reaction, and we're all in it. It's a runaway train.
There's also a political economy dimension to this that shouldn't be overlooked. Russia is the world's second largest fertilizer exporter, with Gulf fertilizers stuck behind a closed strait. Orders for Russian fertilizer are increasing, including from African countries. That means Russia is benefiting economically from a war it had no part in starting. And China, meanwhile, has also just announced a zero tariff treatment for imports from 53 African countries coming into effect from the 1st of May. In a moment when the US is imposing tariffs on much of the world, China is doing the opposite in Africa, stepping into the gap and positioning itself as the trade partner of choice for the global south at exactly the moment the US and its allies are consumed by a war that is making everyone poorer. The geopolitics here are not subtle. And as you were saying, it's cyclical, kind of a runaway train. This is feeling like we normally just get into our political dispatch hole of despair. So we're going to get even deeper as we start to talk about laptops next.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, this is a problem, isn't it? We did for a while get out of this quite depressing, terrible hole. Isn't the world really bad? But unfortunately, there isn't actually any way of talking us out of this. It is quite bad. So we talked about fuel. We've talked about food and fertilizer, but there's another category of everyday life that this war is hitting, and that's one that affects pretty much everyone else who owns a phone, a laptop, or a computer. We're talking about semiconductors, the chips that power modern technology. And the story here starts with something you might not have thought about before, which is helium.
Not the stuff that makes balloons float or gives you a funny voice, although it is the same element. In semiconductor manufacturing, helium is absolutely critical. It's used during the etching process to shape circuits into silicon wafers, to cool machines that operate at extreme precision, and in lithography the process that prints the intricate circuitry of a chip. There is no viable substitute to it. And here's the problem. Qatar produces around a third of the world's helium supply, and it does so as a byproduct of liquefied natural gas processing at the Ras Laffan industrial city, the same facility that was struck by Iranian drones in early March. Two of the facilities that produce semiconductor-grade helium were taken offline almost immediately. The Semiconductor Industry Association warned back in 2023 that a helium disruption could cause direct shocks to global chip manufacturing, and that warning has now come true.
The scale of what's happened is striking. Helium spot prices have already doubled since the war started. Analysts are projecting increases of between 50 and 200% if shortages persist. South Korean chipmakers Samsung and SK Hynix, who between them account for around 80% of the high-bandwidth memory market and 70% of the dynamic random access memory market, have so far said they have enough helium inventory to last until June. But June is very close, and the recovery timeline, even under optimistic scenarios, is a minimum of 2 to 3 months after production resumes, and 4 to 6 months before supply chains return to anything like normal.
And this is on top of a memory chip market that is already under serious strain before a single missile was launched. So RAM and SSD prices were rising sharply through late 2025, driven by AI data centers consuming chips faster than manufacturers could produce. So DRAM prices surged between 80 and 90% in the first quarter of 2026 compared to the previous quarter. And that figure combines the pre-existing AI demand crunch with helium disruption. Some server-grade memory modules saw spot market prices increases exceeding 400%. In maths classes, when I was at school, we were always told there's nothing beyond 100%. It always seriously confuses me because I was like, okay, so what's more than 100%? So exceeding 400%. So the war, as one tech analyst put it, poured petrol on a fire that was already burning. And that would be an expensive fire because petrol is now incredibly expensive.
Absolutely, Tom. And there is a bromine angle to all of this. No, that is not a Gen Z lingo for calling somebody a bro. It is the element bromine with the atomic number 35 that we're talking about. It is less known, but it is definitely worth flagging. Yes, you can call me a nerd, Tom, but I know my chemistry. Bromine-based chemicals are used in the etching and cleaning processes during chip fabrication. And around 2/3 of the world's bromine supply comes from Israel and Jordan, countries at the center of this conflict. That's another pressure point in the same supply chain. And then there is the energy cost itself. Semiconductor fabrication is one of the most energy-intensive industrial processes on Earth. A single chip fab can consume as much electricity as a small city. That's right. Oil prices surging past $110 a barrel raises manufacturing costs for every fab in Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and China. Those costs get passed downstream to companies, to retailers, and ultimately to you.
We have used lots of acronyms and lots of science-y things in this episode. So what does this mean in practice? If you need a new laptop, a phone, more storage, or a new computer, prices are going up. Analysts at IDC had already projected PC average selling prices rising by 6 to 8% in 2026, and that projection was made before the war. That figure now looks like a floor rather than a ceiling. One tech analyst described it as a supply chain crisis, echoing but potentially exceeding the 2021 to 2022 semiconductor shortage, which, if you remember, was the moment when you couldn't buy a games console or a graphics card for any reasonable price for the better part of 2 years.
Yeah, basically, like getting a PlayStation 5 was near impossible, which is a bit of a shame because a lot of people in the UK were on like furlough. So, there wasn't really much to do at that point. South Korea felt this more acutely than almost anyone. Its stock fell 18% in just 4 trading days after the war started, the worst drop since the 2008 financial crisis, wiping out more than $500 billion in market value. South Korea imports roughly 70% of its crude oil from the Middle East, almost all of it through the Strait of Hormuz. Its entire chip industry runs on that energy. Samsung and SK Hynix alone make up nearly 40% of Korean stock market's capitalization. When the strait closed, it didn't just affect the Middle East, it hit Seoul like a hammer. And that's a really important point, that a lot of smaller countries that are impacted by this, although geographically South Korea is very large, they have like particularly big, like oversized companies within their countries, which are like flagship companies. And when they don't do well, the country as a whole is impacted, which is quite interesting as well in itself.
And the recovery won't be quick, even if the ceasefire holds. Supply chain experts have been clear that for every day the war continues, the time required to normalize supply chains extends considerably. Helium production won't return to normal for months after the facilities restart. Ship inventories are being depleted. New production capacity that might ease the shortage won't come online until late 2026 at the earliest, and for some products, not until 2027 or 2028. The war is still happening, but its effects on the price of technology will outlast it by years.
So we've talked about what this war is doing to people all over the world, from fuel prices to food costs to the price of your next laptop. But there's a bigger geopolitical story running underneath all of this, and it centers on China. Because while the United States is spending billions of dollars waging a war that has rattled the global economy, closed the world's most important shipping lane, and left its president claiming victory every few days without it materializing, China is quietly positioning itself to be the winner.
So how does this work, right? Let's start with oil. China is the world's largest crude importer, and before this war, it was already the dominant buyer of Iranian oil, purchasing more than 80% of Iran's shipped oil exports. In 2025 alone, China was buying an average of 1.38 million barrels of Iranian oil per day, representing around 13% of everything it has imported by sea. Why? Because Iranian oil comes with a significant discount. Iranian light crude was trading at around $8 to $10 below the Brent benchmark on delivery to China, meaning Chinese refiners were saving hundreds of millions of dollars compared to buying from non-sanctioned producers. China's official position is that it rejects unilateral sanctions and that its trade with Iran is entirely legitimate. In practice, Iranian oil imported by China is typically relabeled by traders as originating from Malaysia or Indonesia, something which a lot of the European countries did during the Russia-Ukraine war, which is still going on, where Russia would supply oil to India at a very cheap rate, and they would buy it from India, which would refine the oil and sell it as Indian oil, and therefore Europe meeting all its energy targets.
And just to add, for context, Iran's products have got sanctions on them, and that's why China's doing this sort of method to get around a lot of those sanctions.
So Chinese customs data hasn't shown a single barrel of oil shipped from Iran since July 2022. At least this is the customs data that is publicly available and is considered reliable. Everyone knows what's happening, but nobody says it out loud.
So basically around, because the invasion of Ukraine by Russia was like in 2022, right? In the spring of 2022. So that's quite convenient that now oil has turned up, allegedly. So what happens to that relationship now the war has started? The US issued a 30-day sanctions waiver on Iranian oil in March, a tacit acknowledgement that cutting China off from Iranian supply entirely would cause too much economic damage too quickly. And despite the war, Iran has been selectively allowing ships carrying goods to countries it considers friendly to the transit through the Strait of Hormuz. So China has been receiving shipments of commodities through the strait throughout the conflict. A UAE minister described Iran's approach as extortion on a global scale, allowing allies through while blocking enemies. China, for now, is on the right side of that calculation.
And it's important to kind of understand that US considers that it has the financial, military, and the moral authority to put on sanctions and then remove them, or give like sort of a sanction waiver when it deems fit. It did a sanction waiver for a month, even for Russian oil during the same period, because a lot of the allies couldn't actually or friendly countries to the United States or neutral countries weren't able to sort of supply oil, weren't able to get oil to meet their energy needs. So while US forced India, for example, the US forced India not to buy Russian oil anymore and said that you should buy oil from Venezuela. But when the war with Iran started off, they gave like a waiver to India saying that you can buy oil. We'll allow the Indians to buy oil from Russia. And there was quite a bit of outrage in India, especially with the opposition saying that who is the United States to actually go ahead and allow us or disallow us to buy any resources that India is a sovereign country and so on.
And this goes beyond oil. With Gulf fertilizers stuck and global prices spiking, orders for Russian fertilizer are rising, including from African countries that are desperate for supply. Russia benefits economically from a war it played no part in starting, and China's doing something even more deliberate. A Nairobi-based think tank described it as Beijing, quote, decisively positioning itself as the undisputed long-term economic partner of the global south. The timing is not a coincidence. China is foregoing an estimated $1.4 billion a year in tariff revenue to do this. That is a deliberate geopolitical investment.
So think about what that looks like from an African perspective right now. The United States has launched a war that has sent your fuel prices soaring, your food costs are rising, and your fertilizer supply is shrinking. The US is simultaneously imposing tariffs on much of the world under the One Big Beautiful Act. And then, lo and behold, China arrives and says, we'll take everything you want to sell to us for free. We've been your largest trading partner for 16 consecutive years. We're doubling down. The contrast could not be more stark. This is variable geometry in action. The concept we discussed in our episode on the world order earlier this year. China isn't picking sides in the Iran war. It's just filling every vacuum the war creates.
Just as a very quick side note, I worked for a year for the Confucius Institute at Cardiff University. I had the great pleasure of working with some fabulous Chinese colleagues, and they gave me a really interesting insight into what life is like in China and them living abroad away from China. And the response I got from colleagues and some friends as well about jokes about working for the Chinese government, etc. And my response to them was always, well, you can make these jokes about China if you like, but Chinese society has long pre-existed our society and it will long outlast it. And in part because the Chinese are very good at thinking very far ahead and their tactics are very advanced. And I think they're quite underestimated, particularly by the Americans. So there's also the matter of China's direct role in diplomatic efforts to end the conflict. In late March, China and Pakistan jointly announced a 5-point proposal calling for a ceasefire and resumption of normal navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. China isn't just a bystander here, it's a direct economic interest in the reopening of the strait, given how much of its energy and trade passes through it. But also we've mentioned about helium, for example, as well, and the impact on production of semiconductors and so on. But it also has an interest in Iran surviving as a functioning state because of oil, in Russia benefiting from this disruption, and the US looking like an unreliable partner to the rest of the world. All of those things are happening simultaneously, whether it happens next in the war, China's hand has been strengthened by it.
And perhaps the sharpest irony of all, Trump launched this war partly to seize control of Iranian oil resources and to reassert American dominance in the Middle East. But the main buyer of Iranian oil is China. The main beneficiary of disrupted Gulf fertilizer exports is Russia. The main winner of the soft power battle in Africa and the global south is China. If you set out to design a war that would accelerate the decline of American influence and advance the interests of its two principal strategic rivals, it will look a lot like this one. So, what does this mean for the UK? We've talked about Ireland, about fertilizers, about semiconductors, about China. Let's bring this closer to where we all live at this time, the UK, because the UK is not a bystander in any of this. It is directly in the line of fire economically. And today, as we're recording this on the 16th of April, the BBC is reporting that government officials have drawn up worst-case scenarios involving food shortages in Britain by the summer.
So let's start with where we were a few weeks ago. On the 21st of March, the National Farmers Union, the NFU, President Tom Bradshaw told the BBC that food prices in the UK were likely to rise as a direct result of the war. He was specific about it. Cucumbers, tomatoes, and peppers, the produce grown in greenhouses heated with natural gas, would see increased costs coming through to retailers within a month to 6 weeks. Other crops like milk and dairy, 3 to 6 months. And he used language that would have cut through more than it did. He said that the effect on food production could turn the world supply upside down and will have a dramatic impact. And that was just 3.5 weeks ago.
Absolutely, Tom. And today's BBC report takes it a little further. Government officials have now rehearsed what they're calling a reasonable worst-case scenario, a planning term, not a prediction, they're careful to say. But what's in it is worth understanding. The scenario involves the continued closure of the Strait of Hormuz alongside breakdowns in the supply of carbon dioxide. CO2 might not be something most people think about in relation to food, but it is used in the slaughter of chickens and pigs and in food preservation more broadly. If CO2 supply breaks down, we could be looking at shortages of chicken and pork by summer. The government has already temporarily restarted the Ensis bioethanol plant, a facility that was mothballed just months ago in September 2025, precisely to shore up domestic CO2 production.
The majority of the UK's CO2 is imported from Europe, which is often produced as a byproduct when companies manufacture fertilizer, which requires natural gas. So you have another chain here. The Strait of Hormuz closes, natural gas supply is disrupted, fertilizer production slows, CO2 production slows, food preservation is affected, meat supply is at risk. Every link in that chain leads back to one waterway that Iran controls and that remains shut.
So the Food and Drink Federation has forecast that food inflation in the UK reaching 9% by December. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, this week warned that the war could push the global economy into recession, which we've heard repeatedly over the last few years, and specifically flagged the UK is set to be the hardest hit of the world's advanced economies. We're always at the receiving end of this, which is great. Chancellor Rachel Reeves said that this week the US made a mistake by ending diplomatic negotiations and going to war. Meanwhile, the government's emergency committee, COBRA, has been meeting to discuss the impact of the cost of living, fuel prices, food prices, household energy bills, interest rates. This is not background noise. This is central domestic political challenge facing the UK government right now. And there's a price cap, which means that energy prices have gone down slightly, but the next review is in July, which we're probably then going to see an increase in prices again. All energy prices are linked to the price of gas. So electricity ends up being a lot higher on average. So so electricity prices are linked to the price of gas, which is a very backward way of doing things. Also, I saw a thing recently that Liz Truss was involved in the selling off of a lot of our natural gas reserves. So thanks, Liz.
But talking about products, let's move into the retail sector. The retail sector is trying to reassure while quietly preparing for the worst. Tesco's chief executive said the supermarket was, quote, in very good shape, but pointedly refused to comment on what might happen to the prices, saying the situation was volatile and unpredictable. The British Retail Consortium said retailers were experienced at managing supply chain disruption, which is true, but also said that Middle East situation was adding inflationary pressure at a time when retailers face already significant new costs from domestic policies. That's a pointed reference to the government's employment and business cost measures. In other words, the war is hitting an economy that was already under pressure.
There's also a red diesel issue specifically for farmers, the fuel used in agricultural machinery. Prices are rising, and the farming minister has had to refer concerns to the Competition and Markets Authority over price transparency. When a government minister is asking a watchdog to investigate whether fuel companies are exploiting a crisis, that tells you something about the mood.
But, the idea that fuel companies are exploiting crises, they've got a bit of a track record, I suppose, haven't they? The head of the Agricultural Industries Confederation put it starkly this week. She said rising fertilizer and fuel costs could affect autumn planting decisions. And then she said, that's when we end up with a potential food crisis if the fertilizer and the fuel costs are too much. She's not talking about this summer, she's talking about next year. So the decision farmers make in the next few weeks about what to plant, what to skip, what they simply can't afford to grow will determine what's on supermarket shelves in 2027. So that's a long shadow of, the impacts of this war. What started as internal tensions in Iran has then turned into a regional conflict, which has then turned into a global supply chain issue and potentially a global conflict as well, bringing in China, bringing in Russia, and obviously the US and Israel have been at the center of that. And I wonder how long the regime would have lasted without this intervention, because seemingly the Iranian regime is a bit of a hydra. You chop off the head of the various leadership and then there's more people coming through. This is a very embedded regime into the country. It's not like Venezuela, where the US was able to go into Venezuela and abduct the president and put him on trial in New York. This is something very, very different.
I think this whole situation is, I'm not a supporter of the Iranian regime. Never was, never will be. But when an external enemy attacks, the country and it creates havoc within the country, it always unites the people in some way, right? I don't think they still support the regime, but they support the country. And that's what's happened. Like, it's a certain level of, the United States thinking that it can force a certain level of democracy or, cause a regime change with force. And they've never learned from history, right? It's never worked in their favor. They were the ones who kind of, installed the Shah of Iran. And then it led to, the 1979 protests and uprising and the establishment of the current regime. And this is something which we covered in the past episode of Political Dispatch as well. So it's about creating havoc around the world and trying to position United States to be, a military, superpower once again, which I don't think was ever in doubt. But now it's more in doubt because they didn't succeed on any of their objectives. In the Shia form of Islam, sect of Islam, being killed or the idea of being Shaheed is a very important concept. So if Trump still thinks that they achieved their aims because they were able to eliminate or assassinate Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, it's not true at all, because he positioned himself to be in that place, and for him to sacrifice himself, which kind of united the entire theological sort of regime which exists in Iran. Any detractor would also kind of support them because he attained the martyrdom, which is sacred in Shia Islam. So that's one side of the whole thing, right? The other side of it is China, right? Something which we discussed, the economic power of China, but there's also the military might of China. And they have something which is culturally where they build military might, but they don't show it off. That's Chinese culture. They are extremely powerful at this point in time in terms of their navy and strategically how they're located in different parts of the Middle East or in the Indian Ocean and so on and so forth. And they are the ones who are kind of pushing Pakistan to kind of become the mediator. US has no option but to accept Pakistan as the mediator because they're kind of warming up to the fact that this is one reliable, well, pseudo-reliable, I would say, ally of theirs to kind of help get this peace deal negotiated, which is why Field Marshal Asif Munir is right now currently in Iran. You have the finance minister of Pakistan in Washington, D.C., and you have the Prime Minister of Pakistan in Saudi Arabia, right? So they've really gone out. Pakistan's really gone out into this role of being the mediator, and they're trying to maximize, the optics of it, and also trying to position themselves as a strong regional power that exists and that has a lot of value to global powers. And in all of this, my home country, India, is kind of diplomatically failing, right? Not only is it economically, affected, substantially by this war. 70% of our natural gas is imported from Iran. So we're affected by that because the Strait of Hormuz was closed. A massive Indian population lives in the Middle East, which, ensures that there is remittances that are sent to India close to about 70 odd billion, which is sent every year. And that affects, foreign investment back in India. We fail to take a stance. Iran is our ally. We have a civilizational link with them, and we failed to take a stance. And 2 days before the war started, the Indian Prime Minister was in Israel saying that we're going to be with you now and in the future. And literally in 36 hours, the war started. So that put us in really bad position. And it's almost shocking to think that they didn't know that the war was going to happen. So either, we were foolish enough to think that the war is not going to happen, or we were just not valued enough to be told. Either way, we lost, right? So and to top it all off, Pakistan, with whom we've had like really tense relations since independence, is now the mediator, and we are not. So we've lost our footing in the global south. We've lost our footing in diplomatic circles. Economically, we're affected. We're no longer the 5th largest economy in the world. The dollar value, UK is back to being 5th largest economy in the world, Tom. So, good for you. And the dollar is doing much better. So the rupee is falling at this point in time. The stock markets have crashed substantially, and they're recovering, but that's just trading-based recovery. And in all of this, the Indian mainstream media is portraying, the Islamabad talks failure to be showing Pakistan in bad light, but they should have actually pushed Pakistan to do better because it would have actually helped India. But the optics of it is just so bad that the government of India is just pushing all the mainstream media that it's bought out, of course, to, do consistent Pakistan bashing, which is not helping anybody. I hope a lot of the people are able to, the citizens of India are able to see through this, this nonsense. And it's another funny link that is there between Trump and India right now is that Trump put out a tweet on Truth Social saying that, we're going to be setting up the world's largest refinery. And who's going to be building it? An Indian billionaire is going to be building it, the Ambani family. So they're investing $400 billion over the next few years. And he is considered to be one of the closest friends to Modi. So it's like a vicious circle that exists at this point in time. Whereas there's definitely war profiteering happening from all sides. And it's also put, the US in a very precarious situation. So they're really pushing for a peace deal to happen where the optics favor them rather than Iran. But I just don't see that happening because Iran's just not going to give up on anything.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that, Sid, and thanks for sharing your thoughts too, Tom. I think that this is very much an ongoing situation, and we'll continue to update you on the Political Dispatch. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, because, this was kind of just scratching the surface. We could go a lot deeper.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Let us know in the comments. Give us a rating, share with your friends, family, fellow classmates, and colleagues.
This has been a Be the Change Media Network production. My name is Oli Maude.
I'm Tom Spare.
And I'm Sid Kurapati. You've been listening to the Political Dispatch.